Hello and good afternoon, everyone, or perhaps good morning or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to our parallel event here today, and particularly to be with our speakers for the session, Nuran, Hannah, Meghan, Karen, and Abby. I'm Iysha, Arun, a research fellow and project coordinator at the Dialogue Society, and I'll also be our host for this afternoon. This is our first time engaging with the CSW as the Dialogue Society, and we're honoured to present our own findings accumulated over a series of panels we've organised on the topic of women empowerment, specifically in the fields of politics, the workplace and academia. And clearly further research is needed to encompass other spheres of life, but a lot of parallels that emerge through these studies hopefully will be touched upon today, and we can see some similarities that shine through. I just wanted to start by reminding us of the CSW 65's priority theme for this year, and that is, of course, women's full and effective participation and decision-making in public life, as well as the elimination of violence for achieving greater gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls, which I think our presentation will hopefully fit in quite nicely with. So how we as the Dialogue Society utilise that bottom-up approach of an enhanced dialogue between practitioners, community leaders, academics and experts we have with us today, and the community at large kind of contribute to our main focus of today. And that kind of started through our cultivation of a panel series, and later on with the policy paper that we've put together as a team, and some recommendations that we have from that as well. And we kind of hope that all the dialogues that have gone on so far and those that will continue within this discussion and then further will help, alleviate some of the pressures that women, particularly those in positions of leadership, experience throughout their careers, and, hopefully eradicate that altogether. The issue of women empowerment is something critical for us and our aim at the Dialogue Society of advancing social cohesion, empowering communities, and contributing to community building, which is something we've been doing for over 20 years now as a registered charity, based in London, but doing activities throughout the whole of the UK. So without taking any further of your time, I'd just like to introduce our speakers in speaking order, and then provide some kind of virtual house rules of how the event will go on. So firstly, we have Nuran Ukmezturk, a colleague of mine at the Dialogue Society, a graduate of International Relations from the University of Westminster. Nuran is, and I vouch for this, a dedicated and professional project manager. Her interests are in the NGO sector, and she believes the power of differences bring people together to make the world a better place. And we then have Hannah Lowe, again a colleague of mine at the Dialogue Society, a graduate of geography from the University of London Royal Holloway. Hannah has a particular interest in human rights, politics and development. Her strengths are in research, in policy writing, and again, they're both two areas that I can vouch for entirely as having the pleasure to work with Hannah. Then we have three guest speakers today who all contributed valuable information to our panels. They include Dr. Meghan Campbell from Birmingham University, a senior lecturer in law. Her research explores how the international human rights system can best respond to gender inequality and poverty. Her monograph, Women, Poverty, Equality, published in 2018, explores how the concept of equality in the UN Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women can be interpreted to address gender-based poverty. She's also the Deputy Director of the Oxford Human Rights Hub. Then we have Professor Karen Ann Mumford, a professor in the Department of Management at the University of York. She's been awarded several prizes for her research and has had several areas of expertise and interest. These include labour economics, applied micro and macroeconomics, as well as women in economics. And last but not least, of course, we have Professor Abby Day from Sociology Department at Goldsmiths University of London. Abby's work focuses on building capacity and representing sociology of religion, both inside and outside universities, both nationally and internationally, through teaching, research, publishing, and supervision. She also leads the BA Religion, a unique interdisciplinary program offered jointly with the Sociology, Anthropology, and Politics and International Relations departments within her university. So just before I do pass on to Nuran, I'd like to share some kind of virtual housekeeping rules, as I mentioned, and the structure of the event today. So firstly, please do follow us on social media accounts. That's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can find us as Dialogue Society. And also, if you're watching through YouTube, please do share the event, and it's linked with people who you may think that could find it interesting to their expertise, perhaps. And following Nuran and Hannah, each of our guest speakers will have a 15-minute contribution. And whilst this is happening, we encourage our viewers, both through Zoom and those who are watching live on YouTube now, to add comments and questions, and hopefully I can feed this back into the discussion at our Q&A session towards the end. So thank you very much for listening to me so far. I'll just pass on to Nuran, who will talk about how we initiated the start of what later became our policy paper in this area. Nuran, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Iysha. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Nuran Yukmastuk. I'm the project coordinator of the Dialogue Society. I'd like to start by saying how pleased I am to be able to present at such an important gathering. And I'd like to say thank you all for being here with us today. Today, I'll be briefly talking about the Women Empowerment panel series that we conducted, which later on inspired this panel today, and why we chose women empowerment as the general theme of our events. To begin with, as the Dialogue Society, we aim to build dynamic and inclusive societies that provide a future opportunities for all. And in order to achieve the best form of society, we believe that women's empowerment is a necessity. So women's empowerment includes promoting professional development for women, implementing practices that empower women in the workplace, and promoting equality through community initiatives. The women's empowerment process focuses on shaping frameworks for closing economic gender gaps, fostering diversity, and promoting women's inclusion and equality. Additionally, as a Dialogue Society, we aim to increase women's participation in the workplace and help more women advance into leadership, close the gender gap. And to this end, we organised many projects, research and panel discussions. And the Women Empowerment Panel Series was the most recent project to this end. We organised the panel series to enlighten the issue of women's lack of representation and oppression in three main areas, so politics, business and academia. The panel series aimed to highlight challenges and discriminatory practices that women face in all three of these areas, so politics, workplaces and academia, as well as shared social life aspects. The panel series raised awareness about the asymmetric and unequal treatment of genders and systematic problems and procedures that lead to these practices in the first place. Furthermore, the panel series created solutions and recommendations that could increase allyship, opportunities and representation of women in these areas to support the purpose of women's empowerment. So the first panel series, Women in Politics, discussed the obstacles to female leadership and the challenges faced by women in politics. The second panel, Women in Business, discussed the suppression of women's leadership in the workplace and the complexity of the systematic discrimination. The last and final panel, Women in Academia, addressed the unjustified pressure which women academics face and they're subjected to in order to receive a fair recognition of their work. With 11 respected speakers, and thankfully 3 of them are here with us today, and their valuable input and a viewership of over 1,000, our Women's Empowerment Panel Series reached a broad audience. The panel series created dialogue around the lack of representation and served the Dialogue Society's aim of empowering people, tackling social issues and promoting equality, really. We aim to continue our fight for equality for women through new panel series, publications, events and future projects. To further the same, we organised this panel where we can discuss all 3 of these areas in detail. And we also wrote a policy paper titled Supporting Gender Equality, Examples from Politics, Business and Academia in the UK, which my colleague Hannah will give us more information on. Thank you for being here with us today and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Nuran, for touching upon, how the panels came together. I'll just pass on to Hannah to give us a bit more information about the policy paper.
Thank you, Nuran, and thank you, Iysha, for that introduction. So my name's Hannah, and I'm a research fellow at the Dialogue Society. I'm very pleased to be here and to have been involved in writing this report. So creating a forum for open discussion on the issues that women face in politics, the workplace, and academia really encouraged a continued dialogue built on the personal experiences of our panelists and also on ideas expressed in current literature and research. This policy paper, titled Supporting Gender Equality, Examples from Politics, the Workplace and Academia in the UK, aims to contribute towards discourse on women's empowerment in the UK with a focus on the three areas previously mentioned. It develops an understanding of the issues discussed during the panels, contextualizing issues within wider literature, and goes on to highlight the suggestions made during panel discussions to address these issues, formulating specific recommendations. That said, the main points raised in discussions and explored in the paper, which our panelists will go into further, centered around the underrepresentation of women in senior leadership positions. Within politics, this was discussed with specific reference to the lack of female representation among party candidates for elections, but also the prevalence of discrimination within the candidate selection process was discussed as an issue that pervades workplace culture, as ideas of what makes a good leader have always been gendered and framed within typically masculine language and characteristics. In terms of women within the workplace, a similar focus was given to the lack of women in senior high-pay positions across a range of sectors, perpetuating the gender pay gap, but also the cultural sexism that continues to be an obstacle for women, both in positions of authority, but also throughout women's career progression across male-dominated and female-dominated work sectors. For women in academia, the issue of a glass ceiling, where women experience multiple obstacles in career progression, was raised, highlighting male dominance of senior positions and professorship, despite women actually being overrepresented at graduate level. As well as this, the specific double burden for women who have caring responsibilities was highlighted as an issue that presents challenges for women attempting to progress into the most senior positions within academia that typically have long working hours and work obligations that are not easily juggled alongside family commitments. But overall, the similarities across each three panel discussions highlight how widespread gender discrimination and issues of equality are. For instance, the paper further explores the social biases mentioned within each three areas, discussing the exclusionary nature of social networks within workplaces, politics, and academia that favour male likeness and similarities, excluding women from networking opportunities, which ultimately impacts their chances of promotion and career progression. So the recommendations made in this policy paper therefore recognise the different avenues and approaches available within each area, despite similarities in many of the underlying issues. Policies recommended to improve gender equality within politics also act as a catalyst for improvements in workplaces more generally, since each area is interconnected. Policies include suggestions to further improve the culture within politics, the workplace, and academia to allow women greater opportunities for success and reduce levels of discrimination. Equally, specific practical changes in procedures and existing policies are also emphasised to target issues within each area. And we will have this policy paper in our hands at the end of this month. It will be on our website if you'd like to take a look at it there, or we'll also be emailing it out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannah, for kind of nicely summarising the kind of diverse content of the policy paper. I'd just like to kind of pass on to our first guest speaker today, Meghan, who contributed in the discussions very, very lively on the experiences of women in the political sphere. So, Meghan, it's all yours.
Great, thank you so much for having me, and it's lovely to be here. I'm in Birmingham in the UK right now, so it's in the afternoon, and it's a lovely break to come and talk about women in politics and what is a gender-sensitive parliament. A lot of the sort of academic discourse around women in politics, or particularly in the field I work in, the UN Convention on Women, focuses a lot on getting women into politics and what are the barriers about accessing the political space. And a lot of the debate then centers around the use of quotas or preferential selection. But my presentation today is I think all those things are incredibly important to focus on, and our energy should be there. But also thinking about what happens when women get into these political spaces, and what does the work of equality and human rights do within powerful institutions? So what are the barriers within Parliament to women's full equality or women's empowerment? I think this is a really important question because equality of results, like, oh, great, we have 50% parity of women and men in Parliament, is important, but we need to look about what's the experience of being a woman in Parliament, because equality is more multidimensional and it wants to look beyond just the sort of quantitative outcomes. And the image of Parliament in the UK particularly, but in many other jurisdictions, the legislative body kind of looms large in political discourse, and you'll see kind of generic stock photos of it in the news and in lots of discussions about politics today. And it's seen as kind of the epicenter of democratic participation. But it's important to remember that Parliament isn't just a legislative body, it's also a workplace for MPs, for catering staff, for cleaners, for clerks, for a whole range of people. And as any other workplace, it needs to be safe, respectful, inclusive, and an equal workplace. And because Parliament is a very old workplace, the practices that have developed over such a long period of time have unreflexively been built around the male norm. So what I mean there is the practices in Parliament as a workplace are divorced from caring responsibilities. The language used in Parliament often reflects men's roles and invisibilizes the roles of women or people who are gender diverse. And there can be a marked inattention to sexual harassment in the workplace. Recognizing this dual role of Parliament as a legislative body and as a workplace can open up avenues and to tap into existing structures, existing models to dismantle gender biases and structures and to recreate a more gender sensitive Parliament. And in transforming a gender sensitive Parliament, it's really also crucial to adopt an intersectional perspective. So it's not just about achieving the equality of, say, elite, middle class, white women who are MPs, but for young women, for older, disabled, women of color, women with caring responsibilities, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and gender diversity. And in the time I have today, I'm going to look at 3 different aspects about gender-sensitive parliaments that have been in the news in the UK a bit, and also really important and part of this larger struggle for women's equality in politics. The first is balancing caring and working responsibilities. Second is the language of Parliament. And the third is sexual harassment. So turning first to balancing work and caring. In every workplace, people have their work life and they have their home life. And we need to structure our working days, our working loads, to make sure that we have the energy and time to have a work life and a home life. But the structures of Parliament are actually quite poorly designed to achieve that ideal of maybe perhaps elusive work-life balance. And what, particularly around the idea of caring responsibilities, the idea that people who work in Parliament, MPs or in other roles, have caring responsibilities. And Parliament needs to be built up and designed with recognition that people are in caring relationships that require their time. And in doing so, it needs to foster a culture that both recognizes the value in caring relationships, but also goes a step further and doesn't just see caring relationships and caring duties as the role of women, but brings men into caring roles and redistributes care from solely being an individual's burden to the public, recognizing the social value of care. So some ways that Parliament can do this is around working hours. We can make sure that working hours are kind of controlled better to make sure people have time to spend with their families in the evening and the weekends. So one thing would be to prohibit voting after 7 p.m. To think about workload allocation and how much work needs to be done to reduce working on weekends. This is also really important for MPs who don't live close in London, who might have to travel on weekends, to make sure that they're able to both fully participate and still be able to get home at a reasonable hour. Another key thing is to coordinate sitting days more closely with the school calendar so that people who have care responsibilities when spring break or summer vacation comes up, they are not always being torn between 2 different locations. The other big one is maternity leave, and this has been in the news in the UK just over the past couple of weeks. So generally, women in the UK are entitled to maternity leave and statutory maternity leave, except members of Parliament. They're excluded from the legal entitlements of maternity leave. Recently, a member of cabinet became pregnant, And the government has introduced a bill to provide 6 months of maternity leave, but only to cabinet members. So other types of members of parliament are still excluded. Only this kind of very, very rarefied elite women who are cabinet ministers can get maternity leave. Everyone else is still excluded. So the system of maternity leave is based on a hierarchy within the workplace, and it's arguably a very flawed system. The need for maternity leave is just the same as a cabinet minister as it is for a backbencher, as it is for any other woman in the workplace. And maternity leave needs to be expanded and included. And talking to friends anecdotally about this, it's very clear as well that the exclusion of MPs from maternity leave is common across many jurisdictions. Again, a real sign of the male norm. Historically, women weren't in parliament, nobody was getting pregnant, nobody needed maternity leave. But things are changing and we need to have strong maternity leave policies. Also important is to bring men into the caring role, to have adequate paternity leave, and to use meaningful incentives to make men use their paternity leave. So caring isn't just the woman's role. In returning to work after you've had a child, there needs to be some care and thought put into that as well. There needs to be safe and accessible places to express and store milk, and women should be able to breastfeed without stigma throughout Parliament. We can see there's been some instances where women have brought their children into Parliament and that's kind of made the news. Is this or is this not an appropriate space for children? As a gender-sensitive Parliament, we should be strongly advocating that you should be able to bring your child into, especially when they're very tiny, into these kind of legislative bodies. Daycare centers need to be available close to key locations, and the working hours of the daycare should reflect the working hours of Parliament. It's not any good if you have a daycare that ends at 5, but you're working until 7. And there needs to be a stronger recognition of entitlement to paid caring leave. Care doesn't just happen when you are pregnant or when you first give birth. The requirements of having caring leave extend far beyond. So the attention to these type of working conditions can help ensure that Parliament becomes an attractive place, or a place where women's equality can be fulfilled rather than constantly running into barriers. The second thing is around language. Often the procedures and processes around Parliament use very gendered language, or the he pronouns. Chairman, ombudsman are sort of the obvious examples. We need to think about our language to make sure it's more inclusive. Uses pronouns that are he, she, or they, that women aren't referred to by reference to their marital status, which is a very, very common one. And this one can seem a bit window dressy, or what does it really matter? It's just political correctness gone extreme. But it's important to acknowledge the role of language in shaping gendered behaviors and gender relations. If you're never the one who's being talked about, you don't exist in the same way. The third thing is about sexual harassment. There has been studies, we know this sexual harassment does occur within Parliament. There's usually some examples of some MP somewhere around the world at any given moment saying something kind of sexist or misogynistic within a House of Commons or a legislative body. We can know it happens in many, many instances, in many, many manifestations. And we need to bring a human rights lens to thinking about sexual harassment. So it's not just about punishing the perpetrator, but it's about creating a culture where the sexual harassment is condemned as what it is, a violation of women's rights, and where sexual harassment is, the whole process of accountability for it places women at the center. The failure to do so within Parliament is also deeply, deeply problematic. It creates myths that sexual harassment is an acceptable way to relate to each other. It also is very important because the power imbalances between different actors within Parliament can mean that sexual harassment is even more disturbing and problematic. We have MPs sexually harassing clerks, for example. It also makes it difficult for the women who are not in the position of power to claim for accountability or even to say what has happened to them. Right now, with the equality legislation, and this happens around the world, because MPs are not employees, they're not workers in the same way, they can be excluded from legislation around sexual harassment. And so we need to make sure that when we think about drafting laws, that we are inclusive to ensure that sexual harassment is covered within different setups of working relationships. The other big thing is to strengthen internal accountability procedures. And about 4 things need to be done. one needs to be sure that there's adequate human and financial resources. So when you're going to have a sexual harassment internal procedure, you can't kneecap it from the beginning. It has to be adequately funded, adequately staffed to ensure it has the support and really sometimes the funding it needs to be successful. There also has to be creating a culture of encouraging reporting of sexual harassment. Again, it's one thing to have it, but if no one feels comfortable using it, it's a bit kind of hollow. So it involves ensuring that there are confidentiality. So if you report sexual harassment, you can do so in a way that's confidential and it's not going to be leaked to everybody, to ensure that the person who's experienced sexual harassment is able to kind of be informed as the process develops, so that they feel they have an ownership or control of the accountability mechanism. Also to ensure that there are procedures or safeguards to protect against backlash, especially if you're coming up and saying sexually harassed by someone who's very powerful. We know from years of study that women will experience backlash if they come forward. Social media will be trolled. If you're unfortunate enough, you'll be all over the headlines. So you want to ensure that your sexual harassment procedures are not exposing women to more inequality. Depending on the circumstances of sexual harassment, you might want to think Parliament might need to have more clear guidelines on hiring external investigators. Given the power imbalances between different people, that it's so important then to have external investigators who are a bit more neutral to be able to look at the alleged incident. And the remedies have to be meaningful. Again, it can't just be sort of token gestures or tokenism, because it's not really bringing human rights accountability. Meaningful remedies so that people can see that there is accountability for sexual harassment. So just to conclude, the working patterns of Parliament have for so long been based on a male breadwinner model, that men go into Parliament and make laws that the rest of us have to live by, and very divorced from different ways of living, particularly divorced from caring relationships, divorced from the value of caring relationships. And women shouldn't have to conform to sort of a male breadwinner norm. They shouldn't have to conform to he language. Oh, all us guys are here, it's all fine. They should be able to have language that reflects who they are and how they identify. And they should be able to go to a workplace that is free of sexual harassment. And efforts to undo the male norm and to achieve equality within Parliament shouldn't replicate other forms of hierarchy. So we shouldn't see a maternity leave policy that only privileges those at the elite end of the workplace hierarchy, but ignores the needs of others. So attention to Parliament can give us an inroad, attention to Parliament as a workplace can give us an inroad to thinking about typical workplace policies that could be applied into Parliament that can help make sure it is an inclusive space for all people. So I'll end there. I look forward to everyone else's presentation, and I'll be happy to talk more on questions about equality or quotas or affirmative action or any of the other things I talked about.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. I mean, I made some notes whilst you were talking, so I'm sure others do have some comments or questions they'd like to ask. It was nice. I mean, you'd mentioned it in our panel before, how the male narrative is the norm and everything structured around that. But it was nice to hear it again and hopefully, have some productive discussion come from that. So thank you very much. Now we're on to Karen, who will touch upon the women's experiences in the business atmosphere. Karen, you are muted.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Good. I'm hoping I can share my screen with you. So let's just try that. Okay, can you see my slides?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about actually is position of women in academic economics. Okay, so this is data from the Royal Economic Society Women's Committee. The Women's Committee was formed in 1996, and they were very worried about how few women there were in academic economics, and they really needed some hard evidence so they could prove how few women there were. and think about what sort of policies they could put into place or encourage universities to put into place to increase the number of women. So they sent out a survey, a paper survey, to all of the departments and asked them to complete it. And it was sent back, and we put together this data file. And then over time, different members in the Economic Society's Women's Committee have done the same thing every 2 years. And so in 1996, looking at standard academic positions, so positions which were a mixture between teaching, research, and administration, less than 15% of the workforce in academic economics were women. If you included research positions, which were typically temporary, that number went up to just over 17%. Over time, the data moves around a little bit, depending on response rates to the surveys. And in here, it shifted from being a paper survey, because the response rate became quite poor, and started to be scraping web pages. And then very recently, it's gone on to using HESA data. Okay, but you can basically see that over that time period of 20 years, less than 15% of the academic economics workforce were female to roughly 25%, with a fairly constant increase in line amongst researchers. So we can split that up, comparing lecturers or associate professors with professors. So I'm labeling it associate professor here because that's the terminology you get, especially in North America. So here's the UK. In 1996, 9.6% of the lecturers were female. In 2016, 25.8% were. So it's, gone up quite substantially, almost threefold. If you look at the professors in 1996, there were 4% of the professors were female. In fact, in 1992, as far as I know, there was only one female professor in economics in the whole country, and that was Denise Osborne at Manchester University. So tiny numbers. In 2016, it had gone up to 15.5%, and now it sits around 16.5%. If you compare us with other countries, we're not really that different. So Canada, 10.9 compared to 9.6, 27, 25, 5%, 4%, 14, 15. Yeah. Here's the American data. So they were 13% in 99 and 25, 6% and 13. Yeah. So this is a discipline, an academic discipline, which started with very few women and still has very few women, especially amongst the professor ranks. If you look within gender, so let's just look only at the women and see what's happened to their progression rates. So in 1996, we can see here, this is professors. And so in 1996, it was about 4%. And then over time, it slowly increased, but it's still not very high. This middle line is readers and senior lecturers, and that's gone up. And this top line is lecturers, which have fallen. But lecturers are still the dominant career. They're still the dominant rank, job rank amongst women academic economists. If we look at the men, this is professors, the dashed line. So at the beginning of the time period, about 22% of the men were professors. By the end of it, it's about 36%. Amongst the lecturers, they too have gone down, like they have for women, but it went from about 53% and it's gone down to just over 30%. Really strikingly, amongst male academic economists, you're more likely to be a professor now than any other job rank. So there's a really big difference between the proportion of women who are professors and the proportion of men who are professors. Okay, so we can look at what the probability is of getting to be the different job ranks. And so we ran an econometric technique called audit probit, and we controlled for all the sorts of things that we thought might influence your probability of being employed at different job ranks. And Meghan will probably look at this and think there's so many factors that are not in there, and I absolutely agree. So, but part of it is just being able to get the data. Yeah. But having said that, we control for the level and quality of your own education. So we know what quality, we know whether they've got a first-class undergraduate degree, we know if they have a PhD, we know when they got their PhD, we know where they got their PhD from. We know their research, journal publications, where they published. We know what sort of research funding they have, how much funding. And we also have their own, we did a survey and the academics told us what their teaching evaluations were as well. Yeah. Now, all of these things are subject to bias. So we know that, for example, females get lower teaching evaluations, and I can just pretend that you're a man online and you will get better teaching evaluation. So they're all subject to bias. But even so, we control for them. We also control for whether they had children or not, if they were married or not, ethnicity and their age. We control for a whole bunch of workplace characteristics. So the research rank of their department, whether it was a business school or not, where it was, what the region was, percentage of women in the department, if there were networks available, if they were mentored, if they thought it was a cooperative, competitive workplace. And we also control for other factors like how long they've been at the institution they worked in, had they been recently promoted, had they been recently turned down for promotion, had they been offered outside jobs, did they work part-time, et cetera, et cetera. So we control for all of that, all the things that we thought could influence. And what we found is that males, after controlling for all of that, males were 10.45% more likely to be professors than women. Women were 6.9% more likely to be lecturers. Yeah, so and these little asterisks signify that that's at the 99% confidence level statistically. Yeah. So basically, you're 10.5% more likely to be a professor if you're a man, and you're 6.9% more likely to be a lecturer if you're a woman. And you can see it flips from being more likely or less likely for a man down here at the bottom ranks, and then becoming much more likely for men to be professors. Okay, so then we thought, what about if we look at the influence on the pay of men and women? In 1999, David Blackaby and his co-authors looked at this. So they collected data in a very similar way. They did a survey, it was sent out by the Economic Society, and they ran some regressions and worked out the gender pay gap. And they controlled almost for everything that we did, but they didn't have a little bit of information. They had a little bit more on work experience and job tenure squared. And we had to leave some of our other variables out to match theirs. Okay, so they found in 1999 that there was a 9.4 log percentage point pay gap in favour of men. So in 1999, men were earning 9.4% more than women across all of the academic economics. And it was mainly coming statistically because women were earning less as lecturers than men were. There was a little bit amongst professors, but it's not significant because there were so few professors as well. But really, the biggest part of the gap they could identify was amongst the lecturers. Yeah? So male lecturers were earning 6.3% more than female lecturers, and that was the main part of the 9% gap. So we replicated it, and we tried as hard as we could to match all of the variables that they used. And what we found in 2016, so almost 17 years later, was that the pay gap had actually gone up. Yeah? So instead of being 9.4%, then now it's 10.3%. And what we found is that these two swung around. So the pay gap wasn't being driven by men earning more as lecturers. It was because male professors were earning very much more than female professors. This is 14% pay gap amongst professors. So combining men being much more likely to be professors and men earning much more when they are professors, academic economics has become much more, what's the right word? A much more favourable place to work if you're a male than if you're a female. Okay, so that's what our conclusions say, that basically you're much more likely to be promoted to be a professor if you're a male, and you're much more likely to stay amongst the lecturers if you're a female. And in this, comparing these time periods, we found no fall in the academic pay gap. In fact, it had gone up a little bit, and the increase was associated with men amongst professorial rank, especially earning lots more money. Now, just as a sideline, actually women don't report lower job satisfaction amongst academic economics, And it's because they don't care that much about pay. The pay doesn't come up in their job satisfaction regressions. Yeah. What they really care about, and this comes back into Meghan's point, is the quality of their workplace, how cooperative it is, what their colleagues are like, and if there's a lack of discrimination and bullying, and also that the supervisor listens to them. And they're the sort of factors that, and it could be just because we know there's not much we can do about pay, so we've learned to ignore it, because it makes us just too unhappy and causes cognitive dissonance. But okay, so that's what I wanted to share with you. And I think that's probably my time. So if you have any questions, I'll come back at the end.
Yes, thank you very much, Karen, for both contrasting the lived experiences and also the role that financial factors such as pay and the gap in pay also plays. I made some notes. I'm sure we'll have some questions towards the end. Now we're on to our final speaker, Professor Abby Day, who I believe will be sharing a presentation as well. So I'll just pass on to you, and then you can have that shared, hopefully.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen here just to pull up a bit of a presentation. I have actually the great privilege of not only speaking for myself, but to some degree, I'm also summarizing what went on in the panel discussion that we had. So forgive me if I continue to refer to my notes. I don't want to misquote any of my fellow speakers. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for organizing it. And thank you to the previous two guest speakers who have also made points that are very important, and I have similar ones. So I can see how we all really line up in many of the same issues. The issue that I want to talk about, particularly in academia, I position myself here for a moment. I describe myself as Anglo-Canadian, born in Canada, but I was really in Britain most of my life, and certainly all of my education. At Goldsmiths, I'm a professor of race, faith, and culture, specializing in the sociology of religion. And that's not because I'm religious, because I'm not, but I recognize religion is a major social force as well as a personal force, and so it has to be understood, and has to be understood sociologically. Before I re-entered academia, I had a career in academic publishing, and I've written about that and I've researched about publishing and about funding. And so I'll also speak a little bit about where I see in academia some of the disparities, gender disparity. My presentation is also informed by a forthcoming edited collection I'm doing with several colleagues called Doing Diversity in Academia, and trying to find some practical case studies to show us some ways ahead. So that's really the focus here, is both drawn from my research and practice over the last 30 years or so, and also from the panel that we had, the Dialogue Society in December, when I was able to speak with two other female academics. And again, their comments I'm going to be drawing on a little bit. So the main themes I want to talk about is something that came up at the panel and also reflects much of my own work. One very interesting common theme was how women's academic careers are often not standard. Women report sometimes having very different career paths. I'll explain why that may be the case. And also they struggle to gain visibility for their academic contributions, for both creation and dissemination. And I think that has a very important impact, and not simply the impact that we all recognize of the damage that it does to the individuals who are not able to contribute, or whose contribution, as you've heard from the two previous speakers, are not institutionally or financially recognized. But also there's an impact because we're not grasping the importance of women's knowledge and the way that this can actually affect the learning that we know and that we teach within our various disciplines. So one of the other speakers on a panel, Dr. Christine Callender, talked about her academic experience very much as she described it, a game of snakes and ladders. I don't know if everybody's childhood experience is the same, but to some degree or other, who might be familiar with that game where you're going along with your little piece and you think you're making progress, and all of a sudden somebody jumps at you and you lose the progress you made and you have to start again. And she was describing this as really important, and she was referring to the work of Nicola Rollach, whose 2019 report talked about the very different trajectory of women of color. Particularly, she mentioned Black academic women professors. At the time of the report, there were 35 in the UK, 140 Black professors totally. That represents 1% of all professors. The report also found that Black women frequently experience bullying and stereotyping, and not just by men, often by women. And they need to move around the sector. And they find, and particularly in her case, they might get promoted in one institution only to go to another and find, for whatever reason, that promotional level is not recognized. And so, like the game of snakes and ladders, they go down again. So it was a very different kind of trajectory than most men and many female academics might experience. So I want to just leave that point for a moment to reflect on it, because I think it's really important that we can look at something that is different in so many forms from the male academic experience. Another very interesting point that Dr. Callender brought up was that women often put themselves forward for promotion at a much less frequently than men do. And reports have shown that women would often say something that, well, they weren't quite sure that they met all the criteria, and so they wouldn't put themselves forward just yet. Men, on the other hand, seem to put themselves forward even if they haven't met the criteria, and just hope, you know, it'll be okay. So women seek promotion less often. Other research shows women seek pay increases less often. And I'm sure that this is a result of the way that we've all been socialized in the wider world as well as academia, as perhaps not to think that we are really as valuable, and we're not going to be as valued in the institution. That was a very important point that she brought up. Another speaker on the day was Professor Eileen Barker, who from the London School of Economics was reflecting on her 50 years in academia, and again looking at some unusual forms of her career. One example I thought was interesting. Early on in her career, LSE recognized they didn't have as many women academics as they should. So they thought they would show them to be more visible. So they appointed them to everything. So they got onto all the committees, and therefore were really stretched in ways that men weren't. Maybe it was unintentional consequence, but women can be stretched unfairly and not able to manage in the same way. So the other thing that she mentioned quite a few times that I thought was interesting was that there are, again, examples of women not asking for recognition, not asking for the pay rises, being brushed aside when they do, often suggesting that, particularly within, and she mentioned, I know this sounds almost like we shouldn't really complain. I am also a professor, and it took me a while to work out that becoming a professor isn't the end of it. There's pay bands within professorial status. I didn't know that. She didn't know that. Something that men seem to know. We weren't sure why the men all know that. Anyway, so I thought that was interesting, that it is something that women were just not keeping an eye on in the same way that men may be. I just want to turn now to some of the issues that have come up with my own research in the study and teaching and research of predominantly sociology of religion, and my more recent involvement in the move of decolonizing or liberating the curriculum. Now, crudely put, and it is very crudely put, but the impetus here is to try to widen the representation in the discipline, where there's not such a small set of identity categories being represented, very crudely equated to white men of the global north. It may be crude, but you know, go to an academic conference and look around and look at the names that come up on publications, and you'll see, as the sociologist Sarah Ahmed said, white men cite other white men. Maybe this is one of the reasons that they proliferate and predominate. But again, from my own particular perspective in the study of religion, I would look at this also and say that not only do we not see women being represented, but we also don't really understand, as we should, the field of religion. And what counts as religion tends to be created with men with very limited views on what is religion. And just for an example, the anthropologist Fiona Bowie pointed this out some time ago, that a lot of what we know religion to be was discovered by male anthropologists who went out to far-flung places in the late 1800s and early 1900s, often on the payroll of their home countries, who were looking at these interesting areas in the world and wanting to know if they would be okay. Could they visit there? Could they travel? Could they trade? Could they conquer? And so they sent out lots of people to investigate. Now, some of those were also interested in religion, and yet when we look at what we understand religion to be, we have to put that in the context of a white, foreign, strange man appearing in the middle of a new continent and sometimes new country, new island, not recognized, only greeted by men, only talked to with men, not able to enter the female-only spaces. And on the grounds of that, they worked out definitions of religion. So it's not surprising that a religion is mainly defined very much in terms of ritual, because that's all they could see is the public ritual. And why the sometimes more quiet and less visible labor of women never really was seen, and so wasn't counted. And even today, I struggle with my male counterparts to allow them to accept that the women that I have studied who contribute to their religions by social work, by baking cakes, by cleaning churches, are performing religion in their way and should be counted as such. So that's very important that we have this kind of taken for granted assumptions. And I like this quote by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. She wrote this in 1899, and I'm sure we're all familiar with her work, right? No, of course we're not. Like so many early women sociologists and academics, her work wasn't paid any attention and not provided the same with the same dissemination or the same worthiness of male. But anyway, as she said, there are very many taken for granted assumptions about nature that are gendered with an apparently natural social order that depends largely on the unpaid labor of women. And here we can see that many other pieces of research now have been trying to show that. Sabah Mahmood's study of the piety movement, looking at what appeared to be a return to something that she said that many women would have turned away from in the 1990s and early 2000s, that many Muslim women were reclaiming. And what were they reclaiming? And as she concluded in her study, they were reclaiming a kind of religious duty, a kind of religious labor that saw themselves embedded much more and connected. The impact on academia we can also see now in this context as so gendered. Maybe it will help us understand why it is that women publish less and receive fewer grants than men do. Now, I think one of the reasons for that seemed to be, when I first started to look at this, that maybe the big review councils in the funding bodies didn't like women or didn't approve the work of women, but the funding bodies noticed that they had fewer women, so they undertook some research. And one of the things they found was quite unsurprising but interesting, was that quite the impact wasn't, they said, once the funding applications got into the funding body, but rather it was a number that were submitted, and many more from men were submitted, which, again, when we think about it, isn't surprising for two reasons. One, funding applications, especially ones for large centers, tend to go along with seniority in institutions, and women are not represented at those senior levels. And also, well, to be crude about it, when do women have the time? So we do have very much still the tradition of unpaid labor at home as well as in workplace. Many women academics will find that in the workplace, they're often the ones that will undertake the more pastoral, caring roles. At home, they are still working very much in the home with their own labor and not sufficiently supported by their partners. So where do they have the time to be able to do so much of the effort that's required on publishing and funding? So many women may be at home cooking dinner for their family while their husband is still at work on his latest research application. And so we have this combination you heard of from previous speakers of women's very gendered roles and how they have impacted on academia. So what do we do? Well, I suggest that scholars pay more attention, deliberately pay more attention to the work of women scholars. See how we can provide much more dissemination of theories and ideas and paying attention to a much wider range of knowledge. Looking at the Dialogue Society policy paper that has been presented, I thought was very interesting, their paragraph here. Encourage the female rewriting of the experience and encourage the funding for that research into that rewriting. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions that we might be having soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abby, for both picking up upon. I think that panel was the most lively one in the series.
Right.
Mainly because I think a lot of people were able to experience their own grievances as a member of a person of color and someone who's been in academia for over 50 years, and a lot of dynamics and people could share in that panel how their lived experiences correlated with the research. So it was nice to be reminded of that and have that dynamic in the discussion. Just before I open the floor to questions, I was wondering if any of our speakers had any questions for each other at all in the research that's just been presented.
I might ask a question, I mean, to either speaker, if I might. One thing that comes up in my discipline, I don't know how much is represented in yours, there's a very low rate of progress in religious studies amongst female academics, and they also notice this in philosophy. So women will get into it, they'll start as an undergrad, everything's going fine. Fewer of them go on to do a PhD, fewer of them then go on to institutionalized academia. And a very good study was done out of Durham University, and inquiring into why that might be so. And I find that very interesting. And I don't know, Meghan, if this will relate to Parliament, or Karen, I don't know if in the field of economics it would be the same. But a lot of women reported that the style of behavior within those disciplines that were dominated by men were really antithetical to a lot of their experience and a lot of their schooling. A lot of them hadn't gone through the kind of male public school debating clubs and were very uncomfortable with the sort of style that would be pushed in a lot of the seminars, and very combative sort of style, and felt themselves quite excluded from that. And so I don't know how much attention is being paid to the cultures of learning within our different disciplines, and just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Should I go first?
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yes, Abby. There's been lots of work being done on this recently. There's been studies looking at even just having gendered examples in undergraduate textbooks, and they find that there are very few women used as examples. These are just hypothetical examples. They tend to be male. There's been lots of studies looking at hostile seminars, how much time is given to females in answering questions, how many times the chair will notice a female asking questions with her hand up, the nature of the language that people use when it's a female speaker. There's also been studies, as I'm sure you're aware, of looking at student evaluations, and you can basically trick the students and tell them it's a male presenting exactly the same material or a female, and the evaluations are much lower for females. And also just the basic networking process, which is harder to identify. And so it's sort of more a view that people think is happening, that males seem to be more relaxed mentoring other males and telling them about opportunities and just letting them know that things are coming up. on the pipeline that they might want to apply for. And a really nasty recent piece of work was looking at a job web page that was associated with I believe the American Economic Association, and where people could say that they were interested in applying for jobs. And there was a linked web page where people were making comments about the people who were posting themselves and their CVs. And some of the comments that were being made about the women were really, really unpleasant, probably along the lines that Meghan's aware of in Parliament, and a little bit even along the lines of what's happening in Australian Parliament at the moment. And that in combination, it makes it a much more hostile and less rewarding environment for women to stay in. And so in economics, I think that a lot of women in the UK have moved out of academia and moved especially into the civil service, and doing much better there, have much better progression rates, and find it a much more environment that enables them to use their productive skills in a much stronger way. Should I go out?
Yeah, I think there's a similar pattern in law with the culture and the thinking you have to conform to a very sort of masculine version of what it means to be a successful lawyer, who's really aggressive, who, you know, no holds barred, every punch, really, really, you know, nothing. That's the only model of success, is this kind of very, very sort of Hollywood, almost stereotypical version of a lawyer. And I think students definitely feel that pressure to think that that's what they have to do to be successful, and they're not necessarily wrong. I think it's not, you know, it's not you have to be the Hollywood model, but I think there is a sense that you have to very much conform to many different stereotypes, particularly around class as well. If you want to be successful as a lawyer, I think probably also as a politician, that you have to present as a very white middle class. Even if you're not a white middle class person, you have to present with those norms, your mode of speaking, your mode of dress, even the things you do on the weekend, and even sometimes your accent, to be taken as a serious, I think even it's a serious legal academic or as a serious lawyer. So I think it's these subtle cultural pressures that are not always very well articulated that are pushing people to conform to the dominant norm. I'm doing some work with some of my students right now around hair discrimination and how natural hair is seen as unprofessional. That's a really good example because it's seen as unprofessional. And so people will do things that sometimes are quite painful to their hair to be seen a certain way. And no one's telling them they have to do this. There's no, you know, norm or no like direct instruction, but there's just this feeling of having to look or act a certain way, which I think is very persuasive or very, very powerful within law and legal academia.
I mean, just to kind of touch upon personal experience, I mean, the field of dialogue, I think, is one that is male dominated itself. You know, you're talking about policies, you're talking about change in politics and in society. And I mean, when I think about my own secondary school education, I went to a grammar school that was an all-girls grammar school. We did have a male teacher who I kind of see as being my first mentor, and he, you know, insisted that we did actually kind of create a debating club ourselves, and we participated in that. And then, you know, a few of my friends and I wanted to start a human rights group in you know, I think it was like year 8 or something. And although the school administrations themselves didn't support that, you know, we had this history teacher who was a male mentor who supported that. And I think that's definitely something that's sparked and continued my interest in these areas. So, you know, I'm grateful for him. But I do think, you know, those experiences, I mean, I think being in an all-girls school, I probably didn't experience what the sexist stereotypes as much because I didn't have the male physically there countering that. But it was definitely an empowering experience myself. So I think more research does need to be looked into that. We kind of touched upon something in how it crossed over in all the areas that you guys touched upon. I was wondering if the unpaid labour, which is seen in academia a lot, is also in Parliament too. I mean, are women doing a lot more unpaid labour?
What I think is interesting, I think Abby's point was really spot on, but women get then put on these equality and diversity movements. It's your job to bring up the next generation. It's your job to change things. And it eats up your time and energy. And often being on these type of panels or committees or mentorship isn't seen as rewarding when it comes to promotion or career progression. So I think that the work of gender equality often gets tied to being, it's women's job. It's your job to make it more equal, and less interrogation of men's role in undoing the patriarchy, or undoing the, you know, the privileges and the power that they have. And it eats up your time and energy in a way that I think is not talked about maybe openly enough. And we can see a bit of this coming forward with the discussions on violence right now, how more and more people are like, it's not women's job to end violence that men perpetuate. It's not just women's job. And you can see that in who's got the equalities and women in equalities portfolio. It tends to be women. It tends to be women who offer these mentorship roles, who use up their time. And I don't think it's necessarily wrong that they do this. I think what needs to be recognized is that is a valuable skill and a valuable thing that's being offered, and it needs to be kind of calculated in what we think of as a kind of a meritorious politician, or meritorious academic, or meritorious business person.
I think as well, often there's a couple of studies in economics that suggest that when women do the same work as men, they're valued a much lower. So there's a study that looks at co-authored papers, and basically women are less likely to co-author than men, and that might be because they don't have the networks in the same way. But when they do, they're more likely to be put down by other people, considering it that they're a minor author rather than an equal author. And so actually it doesn't go in your favor as a junior academic to engage in co-authored work if you're a woman. You're much more, have a negative impact on your promotion. And there's also been studies that look at the time that is spent in journal publication. And so even though most journals are saying that they're refereeing blind, in fact, we know now we can just do a straight Google search and find out whose paper it is that we're refereeing. And female refereed papers are taking longer to get into the journals than male refereed papers in economics. So I think even when women and men are doing the same tasks, they get valued lower, a little bit like the teaching. And also, I think Megan's exactly right, and Abby as well, that you do get a lot of pressure to take on the pastoral role. So when I first went to York and worked in the economics department, I was the only female academic in the department. And and so you had to be the person who looked after the female students and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those pastoral jobs aren't really valued in the same way. There's not a clear separation perhaps between what the support staff are doing, the admin staff, and those sort of pastoral roles. And so they're not ranked in the same way for promotion.
Can I just jump in on that point? Because I think, Karen, it's so interesting, because there's something similar in law where if women, I think it's in France, but I could be wrong on this, but this principle holds true that if it's a male-only position, then it opens up to women. It then becomes less prestigious. So when women get into the position, then they're not paid as much, or is not seen as like high value or high status. And so you get the access, but now no one cares about it. And they moved on to some other marker of privilege or power that you are excluded from. And that it kind of cuts across, I think, different industries as well. But as soon as a woman is part of it, it's somehow perceived as less.
Yeah, there's been masses of studies on that in economics. And also it's actually written into the very first Equal Pay Act in Australia in 1904 when they introduced minimum wage. If it was a woman's occupation, it was going to get 60% of the pay of a man's occupation. So it was very much in the interest of the men to keep women out of their occupations. Sorry, Abby.
No, it's okay. And that is very interesting. So let's just write that into legislation. Just your point. No, I was thinking about the point about women, about men devaluing certain roles. There's nice evidence to say that in the 1960s and 70s, it became more popular in the United States for women to enter the clergy. And so sociologists looking at that thought it was, maybe about women's, feminism. And well, it could have been about that, but also what they saw was that the pay of clergy was not rising, and men were just not doing it anymore. They just said, we're not doing that. It's not being valued. So they were stepping out, left a space, women stepped in. But it was because they had devalued that job.
It's definitely a very interesting dynamic that I've just coming to first hear it now, but it will be interesting to look into. We do have a question in the chat. How could the female, I think there could be two, I'll read the first one. How could the female academics promote solidarity amongst themselves to eliminate discrimination and advance equality of opportunity? What tools or methods can be used? Yeah.
Shall I start? Let me start. So I was the chair of the Economic Society Women's Committee for, quite a long time. And I think what we found was the most useful was the men, the allies. They were really, they heard the story. They acted in departments to try and increase equality. They changed rules and introduced a code of conduct at conferences, and so I think it's not just about female academics, it's about academics across the board, because most of the academics are might not be aware of what's happening, but when they do become aware of it, I think most of them are really very supportive, and they will act against people that are discriminating and holding others back. So I personally think that's a really good way to go.
So I'm a kind of I want to say I'm a junior academic, but I think I may be more mid-academic now. But I've got to benefit from solidarity and support from female mentors. And I think the things that I found most valuable are, when you can have someone you can talk to acknowledge your own experience, that when you feel like my research isn't being taken seriously because it is about women, or it's about gender, and it's just not seen. And it's just nice to have someone who can say, you're not crazy, you're not making this up. But the other thing I'm thinking about, what has been useful in my career, is where female senior academics have created opportunities, and either create opportunities to publish or opportunities to spotlight my research. And now I'm trying to do the same, spotlight on prestigious platforms women's research that sometimes can get overlooked in the mainstream. So I think it's sometimes also about creating spaces, or alternative spaces, or more spaces, I guess, for that kind of work to be seen, and to promote each other's work and talk it up. Like when I'm at workshops or conferences, I talk about my graduate students' work, or I talk about my other female colleagues' work, because I've noticed men talk about each other's work quite a lot on social media, and they praise each other's work on social media. So I can do the same thing. I can praise my female colleagues' work on social media and in other spaces as well.
Certainly at Goldsmiths, we've got quite a strong mentoring program. It's not strictly for women, but I do find that really helpful. And in SOCRAL, the British Sociological Association, we as well, I started a mentoring program for women. And some of the men said, oh, that's not fair. I said, well, you've had your turn, but we will focus here on younger women academics. I think women-only spaces is good. I conduct workshops about publishing and funding, and I really like the ones that I can ask, could we have this women only workshop, and there is you can talk about all sorts of things. One of the things I talk about quite a bit is for women to drop this myth that gets put out, that women are able to, they're so smart that they can multitask. And I think that's something that men put out, so that we will do the laundry and washing up when we're doing the cooking. So I said to everybody, don't fall into these traps that make it seem that we can do everything. Isn't that wonderful? Because it can be a trap, and we shouldn't trying to do everything.
Just going on to the next question. Abby, it's about your presentation. So Abby showed a slide about what counts as religion tends to be created by men with limited views on the importance and nature of women's religious and spiritual labor. Did you ask a religious leader in your research, clergy, bishops, etc.? The gentleman asking says he's a male and he belongs, and a Christian, retired lay minister, and he belongs to the Mothers Union, a women-led faith organization. He belongs because he agrees totally with and can clearly see all that has been done that's been mentioned during this webinar. So thank you, John, for your comment, and Abby, if you had any.
Yeah, thanks, John. Well, it varies, of course. Most of my research, I have to say, has been conducted in the UK and Canada with the Anglican Church, Church of England. So I'm speaking from a sort of narrow base in terms of my empirical research. But I do notice that women have been, and lay women is my focus. There's been a lot of research on women priests and women bishops. No, I was just looking at lay women who tend to have been quite ignored within the churches and taken for granted. And just one quote stuck in my mind. I sometimes bring this up because one of the male ministers was talking to me and he's saying, oh, these women are wonderful. They do so much. It's so lovely. You know, for example, we'll have a funeral and then like by magic, all these lovely things appear, sandwiches and cakes. I thought, typical, right? He thinks it's magic. It's actually really hard work these women have done and continue to do. And because the generation I study were much, much older, and I go to some of these, you know, book sales or cake sales, and they're like 90-year-old women hauling boxes up and down stairs and doing all this really serious physical and emotional work. And they tend to get patted on the head more than they deserve and patronized. I'm not saying, I don't speak to the Methodist Church, it may be different there, but I think these large, you know, traditional conservative churches tend to have patronized the role of women.
I do think Hannah had a question she wanted to ask, so I'll allow Hannah to ask her question and then return to the questions from attendees.
Thank you, Iysha. Yeah, I was just thinking of this during Abby's presentation, but actually I think it's just as relevant for all of our speakers. I was wondering, how aware do you think male academics or politicians or people are of the experiences of women in their own careers or their sectors?
I think.
Sorry, I'm not sure who I'm not sure who is.
I still have my mic muted, so I'll be very rude and go first. I think some of my younger male colleagues are much more aware of it. Some of them who don't have caring responsibilities. I've been to a book launch where he acknowledged he was able to write this book because he didn't have caring responsibilities. He didn't have any children. So there's definitely a sense of awareness, I think, of my colleagues who are maybe on the younger side of some aspects. I think the ones that are most obvious about, like, if you have children at home in a pandemic, I think people are very aware that that can make working productively very, very difficult. Other aspects of sort of the gender inequality in academia, I'm not sure they're as aware of. Like the fact that women don't get cited in the same way, the fact that their research gets talked down is not important, that the fact that it might take longer to get published, the fact that you don't get, no one recognizes your work in the same way for its importance. I think that one they might not see in the same way.
I think, shall I go next? I think in economics, it's helpful that it's an evidence-based sort of discipline, because I think people feel uncomfortable thinking that they've maybe got ahead because other people have been discriminated against, or that their friends and colleagues are being discriminated against by other people. You know, no one wants to think that's happening. And so I think often people say, well, it's a choice. You know, it's because the women choose to, you know, have children and stay home and look after them and put less effort in and, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So what's really good about economics is we can collect data on that. So we can say, hey, yeah, but look at these women, they don't have children. They didn't go part-time. How come they're not getting the same pay and the same promotion? And, we can track, we can find out, what's happening in their working hours and how much research you're doing and how much this and that and that. And then we can come back and say, we can control for all of this, and we can still find that there's this difference in promotion and pay. And so I think, that's a really useful tool for us to be able to use, that we have this evidence and that we can, say, this is statistically significant, which means no more than that and has no more explanation. And it's in some ways many hollow, but it just gives us a tool that we can use to say it's not a choice factor, it's being imposed on them.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's almost like, well, you signed up for this, so it's all women's fault that we, then have to suffer. I remember I was once on a review panel looking at funding applications in a country, not sure how much I'm supposed to say about this, so I'll just say a Scandinavian country that was very, I thought, quite forward-looking in terms of gender. And we had to decide between various research applications, and there's quite a detailed way to do this. It's not just, whether you like them or not. Everything was given, numeric categories, and we had to debate each section. And finally, we came down to the last two. And literally, they scored exactly the same. They were both great. And so we all kind of looked at each other and said, well, they're both great. How do we decide? And the chair said, oh, well, it goes to the woman then, because that's their policy. All things being equal, the woman gets it. And over time, maybe that will help. Maybe that will help correct some of the gender disparity. I think in America, they call that affirmative action. But yes, in that case, that's just the policy. And I think we need to look at those structural issues as well, and the kind of policies that we could have on board for that reason. And then I love it when men say, oh, well, I think it should be done on merit. Well, as if they're done on merit, right? As if they're all just geniuses and not men who have gone to the right schools, have the right rowing club and all the other things that put them up there into a position of more privilege where they're likely to get, hired, published, funded. So this idea that it's all on your merit, suddenly they seem to be very blind to their embedded privilege that allows so much of their success.
Yeah.
And the comment assumes that merit is a neutral concept, when we know that how merit is defined reflects what's possible for someone in a privileged position. And there's lots of interesting work, and the CETA committee talks about this constantly, about redefining what merit means, because it is a highly gendered, it's not a neutral concept that people deploy it as.
Just to kind of return to the other questions we've got in the chat. Sarah is asking, as a foreigner disabled woman, I have been trying to access academia world and do a PhD, but it seems most spots are immediately filled. Is there any scholarship or organization that help women enter into academia? That anyone knows of?
International Federation.
Unless I'm convinced I know of any organization. Sorry, Karen. You start.
There's the International Federation of University Women, and I don't know how much funding they have, but they do have some funding. But then I think Abby's going to tell you it's really difficult to get, it's very difficult in economics to get PhD funding. And I think that's probably across the board true, but I'll let you keep going, Abby.
Oh, University Women, yeah, that's true. No, it's very difficult to get funding. There are certain organizations that within every discipline, they have a professional organization, and a lot of them are very good on their postgraduate sort of networks, but assuming you're already in the flow as a postgraduate. And I think certainly my experience as a returning academic later in life, when I decided to go back to university, I looked around for those institutions and people that really interested me to try to find out what they were specifically doing, and try to read up on what they were saying and get some kind of contact. So I think whatever you want to do is really, really useful to focus on who the people are that you really would like to work with, and what institutions there are that you would like to work with. And then at least you're focusing what you're wanting to do. And then those institutions will have means to help. Some of them will have financial means, but a lot of them will have, we all put students forward for various grants. So they would then know how you do that. And if you're able then to set up that kind of conversation within a specific institution with specific academics you're interested in, that's just a great way to start the process, not necessarily 100% successful, but it's a way to start the conversation. Yeah, it's be very focused on where you want to be.
I would just echo that think trying to identify academics that you were keen to work with and what organizations they might also be a part of, or associations or groups, can be a kind of way to trace through an entry point in. But I think acknowledging that its funding is tough, it's tighter, it's going to probably get tighter if there's a post-COVID. So not to be too hard on yourself, because the structures are very, very difficult.
We've just got a very long question come in. Just see, I mean, we've had some nice comments from people thanking our speakers for participating. The question reads, I am personally wondering why so many women accept that we see our religious texts worldwide as sacred and accept that they define our religions. To me, as a woman, it is most impossible to relate to the wisdom in our religious texts, as I know that they have all been urged and written down by men solely. Women have deliberately been excluded from the process of writing and translating these so-called sacred texts. As there are much more women than men sincerely practicing their very religion, it seems to me very strange that we as women accept that our religions are defined by texts written in misogynic ancient traditions. It proves that our religion is the very last cultural expression in our societies to be in favor of equality between women and men. But as they are the very basis of our societies worldwide, we need to take all of them into high consideration. Very long comment. I don't know if anyone would like to kind of pick up on that. I think what Abby was trying to do was kind of touch upon the fact that there are women sociologists and women who have written on all women, but perhaps, I'm not sure who quoted it, but that men cite other men and that women perhaps don't have that privilege to say. But I don't know. I mean, Abby, if you'd like to pick up on the comment at all.
Well, just a point of agreement that, well, yes, most religious texts are very male-oriented. Most religions are patriarchal. Yes, that's absolutely true. And women have been trying to change those in different ways and with some degree of success. But yes, you're absolutely right. Some texts are predominantly misogynist, and there are a lot of female theologians. I'm not a theologian, I'm a sociologist, but I know that this is what they do. They try to reinterpret text, try to reposition text to be more inclusive. So that would be a good way to, whatever your religious tradition, to look at academic female theologians who tend to be quite radical in trying to change that.
Yes, so I think that's the last question that we've received, and it's been a relatively long panel. So I thank all our discussers for being here throughout and participating once again and coming back to share your research with us. Thank you everyone who's been watching on YouTube, and thank you of course to everyone who's been watching through Zoom. I mean, this wasn't something that we had in mind when we started, for these panels to evolve into a series, and then for that series to evolve into a policy paper, and then for that to be presented here. So I think it's nice how it can have that snowball effect. So yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to my colleagues Hannah and Nora for being here as well. And Meghan, Karen and Abby, thank you for being here with us again. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their days.
Well, thank you for organizing.